Camela Novak had a problem that made her sergeants' lives miserable. At 5 feet and 120 pounds, she refused to accept that her size meant she couldn't handle real military work. For 18 months, they mocked her relentlessly, calling her Little Bird and keeping her off combat missions while the real soldiers did the fighting. Then came the day she carried 3 wounded soldiers 2 miles through enemy fire to safety. And suddenly the smallest person in the unit became the one everyone wanted watching their back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At Forward Operating Base Thunder in Afghanistan's Kandahar province, Camela Novak stood out for all the wrong reasons. While her fellow soldiers towered over her at 6 feet and 200 pounds, she barely reached their shoulders. Her Eastern European features, sharp cheekbones, pale green eyes, and blonde hair pulled back in regulation braids, made her look more like a college student than a combat soldier. But appearances were deceiving. What her unit didn't know was that Camela had grown up in the mountains of Slovakia, where her grandfather had trained her from age 8 in traditional mountain rescue techniques. She could carry a full-grown man for miles through terrain that would exhaust soldiers twice her size. Her cardiovascular conditioning was extraordinary. She could maintain a steady pace while carrying 180 pounds for hours, a skill developed through years of helping injured hikers in the Carpathian Mountains. The mockery started on her first day at FOB Thunder. Sergeant Rodriguez, a barrel-chested veteran from Texas, took one look at her 120-pound frame and laughed. Well, what do we have here? Looks like they sent us a mascot instead of a soldier." The other sergeants, Martinez, Thompson, and Jackson, joined in immediately. They nicknamed her Little Bird and made jokes about needing a booster seat for the Humvees, but Camela's skill set was extraordinary in ways they couldn't see. During training exercises, she consistently outperformed soldiers twice her size in endurance challenges. While others struggled with the weight of full combat gear in Afghanistan's brutal heat, she moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent her entire life navigating difficult terrain under heavy loads. Her pack was always perfectly balanced, her movements economical, her breathing controlled. The sergeants interpreted her quiet confidence as arrogance. During equipment inspections, Camela's gear was always in perfect condition, her weapons spotless, her knowledge of military protocols flawless. She had graduated in the top 5% of her class from military engineering school and spoke 4 languages fluently, but none of that mattered to men who believed that military effectiveness was measured in pounds and inches. Novak, Sergeant Martinez would bark during morning formations. "You sure you can handle that rifle? Looks bigger than you are." The laughter that followed these comments echoed across the compound, reinforcing a culture where her competence was dismissed because of her appearance. What truly frustrated the sergeants was that Camela never responded to their provocations. She maintained perfect military bearing, followed every order without complaint, and continued to excel in every measurable area of performance. During physical training, she kept pace with soldiers who had 50 pounds of muscle on her. During tactical exercises, her strategies were often the most effective. During equipment maintenance, her attention to detail was unmatched. The assignment pattern revealed their prejudice clearly. While other soldiers were rotated through combat patrols, reconnaissance missions, and tactical operations, Camela was consistently assigned to supply runs, communications duty, and base maintenance. When she requested assignment to active patrols, Sergeant Rodriguez would respond with the same dismissive tone. "Little Bird." Combat operations require soldiers who can carry their weight and their buddies' weight. You stick to what you're good at. What Camela was good at included advanced tactical medicine, having completed paramedic training before enlisting. She could perform emergency field surgery, treat traumatic injuries under pressure, and had memorized every protocol for combat casualty care. She had also completed specialized training in mountain warfare and cold weather operations, skills that would prove invaluable in Afghanistan's harsh terrain. But the sergeant saw only her size. During briefings, they would assign her to support roles while explaining that the real fighting required soldiers who could physically dominate the battlefield. They failed to recognize that her engineering background had given her an intuitive understanding of battlefield mechanics, terrain analysis, and tactical positioning that surpassed many of their veteran soldiers. The culture of exclusion extended beyond the sergeants. Other soldiers, taking cues from their superiors, began treating Camela as a liability rather than an asset. During mess hall conversations about upcoming missions, the talk would quiet when she approached. During equipment distribution, she was often given outdated or inferior gear with the assumption that she wouldn't need the best equipment for her light-duty assignments. Camela endured 18 months of this treatment, watching from the sidelines as her unit conducted the missions she had trained for and was fully qualified to handle. She knew that somewhere, sometime her skills would be needed. She just hoped that when that moment came, her unit would be willing to let her prove what she was capable of. The irony was that while her sergeants mocked her size, they had failed to recognize that Camela Novak was exactly the kind of soldier who could save their lives when conventional strength wasn't enough. The unspoken rules at FOB Thunder were crystal clear. Bigger meant better, and if you couldn't physically intimidate the enemy, you weren't really a soldier. This philosophy permeated every aspect of military life, from equipment assignments to mission selections. The sergeants had created an environment where physical size determined respect, opportunities, and ultimately, survival chances in combat operations. Sergeant Rodriguez embodied this mentality perfectly. A former college football player from San Antonio, he stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed 240 pounds of solid muscle. During his 8 years in the Army, he had built his reputation on the belief that warfare was fundamentally about physical dominance. In combat, he would tell new recruits, "The enemy needs to look at you and know immediately that you can break them in half." That's psychological warfare 101. This philosophy translated into concrete policies that systematically excluded Camela from meaningful assignments. While soldiers like Private First Class Morrison 6'1" and 210 pounds were automatically assigned to high-priority reconnaissance missions after just 6 months on base, Camela remained on supply duty despite 18 months of flawless performance and superior qualifications. The equipment distribution system reflected these biases perfectly. During quarterly gear assignments, the newest and most advanced equipment automatically went to the frontline soldiers, a designation that mysteriously never included Camela. She was issued older body armor, less sophisticated communication equipment, and frequently received weapons that hadn't been properly maintained. When she requested upgraded gear, Sergeant Martinez would respond with his standard dismissal. "Little bird, you're not going anywhere that requires the good stuff." The cost of this systematic exclusion was becoming increasingly apparent to those who looked beyond surface appearances. Staff Sergeant Williams, the unit's logistics coordinator, had noticed that supply runs completed under Camela's supervision had a 100% success rate and were completed 30% faster than the unit average. Her route planning was more efficient, her equipment maintenance was meticulous, and her communication protocols were flawless. But efficiency metrics didn't matter in a culture that valued intimidation over intelligence. During weekly strategy meetings, when Camela offered tactical suggestions based on her engineering background and terrain analysis, her input was routinely dismissed. Sergeant Jackson would interrupt with comments like, "Thanks for the input, little bird, but let's hear from someone who's actually been in firefights." The fact that her tactical simulations consistently outperformed those of more experienced soldiers was irrelevant if she hadn't proven herself in actual combat. Combat she was systematically prevented from engaging in. the informal social hierarchy. Reinforced these professional exclusions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During off-duty hours, conversations about upcoming missions would stop when Camela entered the recreation area. Soldiers would lower their voices when discussing tactical planning, as if her presence might somehow compromise their discussions. The message was clear: she wasn't considered part of the real military unit, regardless of her official rank and duties. What made this exclusion particularly frustrating was Camela's extensive preparation for exactly the kind of warfare they were conducting in Afghanistan. Her mountain rescue background had given her expertise in high-altitude operations, extreme weather conditions, and carrying injured personnel across difficult terrain, all skills directly applicable to their current deployment. Her medical training exceeded that of most soldiers in the unit, including advanced trauma care and field surgery techniques. The financial implications of this prejudice were staggering, though no one calculated them at the time. The Army had invested over $200,000 in Camela's specialized training, including advanced tactical medicine, mountain warfare certification, communication systems, and combat engineering. By relegating her to supply runs, the unit was essentially wasting $250,000 in specialized skills while assigning less qualified personnel to missions that required exactly her expertise. Sergeant Thompson exemplified the dangerous thinking that had taken hold. During a briefing about an upcoming mountain patrol, he dismissed suggestions about altitude acclimatization and cold weather protocols, areas where Camela's training exceeded everyone else's in the unit. "We don't need textbook knowledge," he declared. "We need soldiers who can fight." This attitude had already led to 2 cases of altitude sickness and 1 severe hypothermia incident that could have been prevented with proper preparation. Breaking point in the systematic exclusion came during equipment inspection 3 weeks before the mission that would change everything. Camela's gear passed inspection with perfect scores, as always, but she was again assigned to base communications duty, while less qualified soldiers were selected for active patrol. When she formally requested consideration for combat operations, citing her superior performance metrics and specialized training, Sergeant Rodriguez's response revealed the true depth of the prejudice she faced. "Novak," he said, loud enough for the entire unit to hear, "I don't care if you can recite the manual backwards. When bullets start flying and soldiers start falling, this unit needs people who can physically carry their wounded buddies to safety. You couldn't carry a wounded soldier 50 yards, let alone the distances we might need in hostile territory." That statement would prove to be the most ironic prediction in military history. The incident that truly solidified Camela's reputation as the problem soldier had occurred 8 months earlier, during what should have been a routine equipment certification exercise. The event became legendary at FOB Thunder, not for the right reasons, but because it perfectly illustrated why the sergeants considered her a threat to their established order. The situation began when Specialist Davis, a 6'2" soldier weighing 195 pounds, attempted to demonstrate proper rappelling technique from a 40-foot training tower. Davis had been selected to lead the demonstration specifically because his size and apparent confidence impressed new recruits. What wasn't widely known was that his rappelling certification had expired 6 months earlier, and he had been relying on outdated techniques that violated current safety protocols. Camela, observing from the designated safety zone where she'd been assigned to monitor equipment, immediately recognized that Davis had incorrectly threaded his belay device. The error was subtle but potentially fatal under load. The device would fail to lock properly, causing an uncontrolled descent. Her mountain rescue training in Slovakia had taught her to identify this specific mistake, which had killed 3 climbers in the Carpathians the year before she enlisted. Following proper military protocol, Camela raised her hand and called out, Specialist Davis, request permission to check your belay setup. I'm observing a potential threading error that could cause device failure. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had performed hundreds of technical rescues, but to the assembled soldiers, it sounded like a 120-pound soldier questioning. A larger, more experienced man. Sergeant Rodriguez's response was swift and public. Novak, Davis has been rappelling since before you knew what a rope was. Return to your position and stop creating problems where none exist. The message was clear. Size and apparent experience trumped technical knowledge, even when lives were at stake. But Camela had seen too many preventable accidents in civilian rescue operations to remain silent. Sergeant, with respect, the belay. Device threading pattern will cause lock failure at approximately 150 pounds of dynamic load. This specific configuration resulted in 3 fatalities in European mountain rescue operations last year. She spoke with the precise technical language of someone who understood exactly how equipment failures killed people. The confrontation escalated quickly. Sergeant Martinez joined in, his voice carrying across the training area. Little bird. Thinks she knows better than everyone else again. Davis, proceed with your demonstration. Novak, you're on report for insubordination and disrupting training exercises. What happened next became the defining moment of Camela's reputation at Phobe Thunder. As Davis began his descent, exactly as she had predicted, the belay device failed. To lock at 18 feet of drop, Davis fell the remaining 22 feet, landing hard on the safety mat, but sustaining a compound fracture of his left leg, and severe bruising that kept him off active duty for 3 months. The aftermath revealed everything wrong with the command structure at Phobe Thunder. Instead of investigating why Camela's technical assessment had been ignored, the sergeants doubled down on their original position. The official incident report, filed by Sergeant Rodriguez, stated that equipment failure occurred due to unforeseen manufacturing defect, and made no mention of Camela's warning or the incorrect threading pattern that had caused the accident. More damaging to Camela's standing was the informal narrative that spread through the unit, rather than being recognized for identifying a life-threatening safety violation. She was labeled as someone who created problems and undermined unit cohesion. Soldiers began avoiding her during training exercises, afraid that associating with the troublemaker might affect their own standing with the sergeants. The financial cost of ignoring her expertise was substantial. Davis's medical treatment and recovery period cost the military over $85,000 in medical expenses and lost operational capacity. The training exercise had to be postponed for 2 weeks while new safety protocols were implemented, protocols that were identical to the European standards Camela had tried to cite. A subsequent investigation by base safety officers confirmed that the belay device failure was entirely preventable with proper threading technique. But none of these facts mattered to the command structure that had decided Camela was the problem, not the solution. Sergeant Thompson's assessment during her performance review captured the prevailing attitude. Specialist Novak demonstrates excessive attention to minor technical details that disrupt operational flow. Her tendency to overcomplicate standard procedures creates unnecessary friction within the unit. The irony was staggering. The same attention to detail that made her a superior soldier was being characterized as a character flaw. Her ability to recognize dangerous situations before they became fatal was labeled as creating problems. Her technical expertise, which could have prevented a serious injury, was dismissed as academic knowledge that had no place in real military operations. Following the rappelling incident, Camela's assignments became even more restrictive. She was excluded from all training exercises involving technical equipment, despite being the most qualified person in the unit to conduct such training. Her security clearance was downgraded, preventing her from accessing tactical planning documents. Most significantly, She was formally prohibited from offering technical advice during equipment inspections, unless specifically requested, a request that never came. The message was unmistakable: conform to expectations based on your size and appearance, or face systematic exclusion from meaningful military service. Camela had chosen expertise over conformity, and the price was professional isolation in an environment where teamwork could mean the difference between life and death. What the sergeants at Phobe Thunder truly feared wasn't Camela's size, it was what her competence represented. In a military culture built on the assumption that physical dominance equaled tactical superiority, her success threatened the fundamental beliefs that had shaped their careers and justified their authority. If a 120-pound woman could outperform soldiers twice her size, what did that say about everything they thought they knew about warfare? Sergeant Rodriguez had built his entire military identity around the principle that intimidation and physical presence were the primary tools of battlefield effectiveness. His promotion to squad leader had come after an incident in Iraq, where his imposing 6'4" frame had allegedly intimidated insurgents into surrendering without firing a shot. The story, which grew more dramatic with each telling, had become central to his reputation and his approach to leadership. Camela's quiet competence challenged the very foundation of that narrative. The economic implications of acknowledging Camela's capabilities were even more threatening to the established order. The military had invested heavily in training programs that emphasized physical conditioning and traditional combat skills. If smaller, technically oriented soldiers could achieve superior results, it would require a fundamental reevaluation of recruitment standards, training protocols, and promotion criteria. The sergeants who had advanced based on old-school military values would suddenly find their expertise outdated. More personally threatening was the possibility that Camela's approach might be replicated by others. If word spread that technical knowledge and strategic thinking could compensate for physical limitations, it might encourage other non-traditional soldiers to challenge established hierarchies. The sergeants had seen what happened in other units where rigid traditional structures had been questioned: chaos, in their view, and a breakdown of the clear authority lines that kept military units functioning effectively. Sergeant Martinez's concerns were particularly acute because his own technical knowledge was limited. Despite 8 years of service, he had never completed advanced training in communications, tactical medicine, or combat engineering. His authority came from his ability to project confidence and maintain discipline through force of personality. Camela's quiet expertise in multiple technical areas highlighted gaps in his own qualifications that he preferred to keep hidden. The informal conversations among the sergeants revealed the depth of their anxiety about the precedent Camela might set. During off-duty discussions, Sergeant Thompson would express frustrations that echoed throughout the command structure. If we start promoting people based on test scores and technical knowledge instead of proven battlefield presence, we're going to end up with a military full of computer nerds who fold the first time someone shoots at them. This fear wasn't entirely irrational. The modern military was indeed evolving toward greater technical sophistication, advanced communication systems, and strategic approaches that emphasized intelligence over brute force. Soldiers like Camela represented the future of military operations, while the sergeants represented traditions that were becoming increasingly obsolete. Acknowledging her capabilities meant admitting that their own skill sets might no longer be sufficient for contemporary warfare. The financial pressures they faced personally also influenced their resistance to change. All 3 sergeants were career military personnel who had invested decades in advancing through a system that rewarded traditional masculine military virtues. Changing that system now would effectively devalue their own career investments and potentially limit their advancement opportunities. They had too much invested in the old way of doing things to embrace new models of military effectiveness. Perhaps most threatening was Camela's refusal to seek their approval or validation. Unlike other soldiers who competed for the sergeant's attention and respect, she maintained professional competence without apparent concern for their opinions. This independence undermined their authority in subtle but profound ways. Soldiers began to notice that Camela's assignments were consistently completed more efficiently and with fewer problems than those supervised by the sergeants directly. The breaking point in their tolerance came when Captain Morrison, the base commander, began asking pointed questions about unit efficiency metrics. Camela's supply runs were completing objectives 30% faster than unit averages, with zero equipment losses and perfect documentation. Her communication protocols during supply missions had prevented 3 potential security breaches that other soldiers had missed. The captain's increasing attention to performance data threatened to expose the fact that their problem soldier was actually their most effective operator. Sergeant Jackson's response to this pressure was telling. "Sir, efficiency isn't everything in military operations. We need soldiers who can handle the unexpected, who can adapt when things go wrong, who have the physical and mental toughness to push through adversity." Novak has never been tested under real pressure. This argument became their primary defense against the mounting evidence of Camela's superior performance. She hadn't proven herself in actual combat because they had systematically prevented her from engaging in combat operations. The irony was that, in trying to protect their traditional authority structure, the sergeants had created exactly the situation they most feared. By excluding Camela from meaningful assignments while she continued to excel in every measurable area, they had highlighted the inadequacy of their own leadership approach. The harder they worked to maintain the status quo, the more obvious it became that change was necessary. Their resistance to acknowledging Camela's capabilities had painted them into a corner where they could only justify their position by hoping she would fail when finally given the opportunity to prove herself in actual combat. That opportunity was approaching faster than any of them realized. The morning of October 15th started differently at Fob Thunder. The usual pre-dawn chatter among the mechanics was subdued, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that experienced soldiers could feel but couldn't quite identify. Equipment inspections were rushed, radio checks were abbreviated, and most telling of all, the sergeants were avoiding direct eye contact with anyone below their rank. Camela noticed the shift immediately when she reported for duty at 0600 hours. Sergeant Murphy, one of the few mechanics who still spoke honestly with lower-ranking soldiers, looked genuinely worried when he saw her approaching the equipment depot. His nervous glance toward the command tent and the way he quickly turned back to his checklist sent a clear signal that something unusual was happening. The mission briefing itself was unprecedented in its brevity. Captain Morrison, who normally provided detailed tactical overviews and contingency planning for any operation involving potential combat contact, delivered instructions that were strangely vague and rushed. High-priority reconnaissance mission. In Sector 7, he announced to the assembled team. Intelligence indicates possible insurgent supply routes through the mountain passes. Duration, 48 hours maximum. What made the briefing truly suspicious was the team composition. Instead of the usual squad of 8 experienced soldiers led by Sergeant Rodriguez, this mission would involve only 4 personnel. Specialists Morrison, Chun, and Davis, all soldiers with less than 12 months of combat experience, and, unexpectedly, Camela. The selection violated every protocol for high-risk reconnaissance operations, which required at least 1 squad leader and a majority of experienced personnel. Sergeant Rodriguez delivered Camela's assignment with unusual formality, reading directly from written orders rather than providing his typical verbal instructions. Specialist Novak, you're assigned as communications operator and medical support for Reconnaissance Team Alpha. Mission parameters require advanced medical training and technical communication skills. The carefully neutral tone was completely unlike his usual dismissive manner when addressing her. The equipment assignments revealed additional irregularities that set off every alarm bell in Camela's mind. Instead of the standard reconnaissance gear, the team was issued heavy combat equipment, including extra ammunition, extended medical supplies, and most unusually, mountaineering equipment that hadn't been used in months. The climbing gear was particularly suspicious. It suggested they expected to encounter terrain that wouldn't be necessary for standard reconnaissance in Sector 7. More concerning was the radio equipment she was assigned. Instead of the standard short-range communication devices used for reconnaissance missions, Camela received long-range emergency beacons and satellite communication, equipment typically reserved for extraction operations. When she questioned the discrepancy, Sergeant Martinez's response was evasive. "Just follow your orders, Novak. Communications protocols will be provided en route." The timeline for the mission was equally suspicious. Standard reconnaissance operations in Sector 7 required 72 to 96 hours for thorough intelligence gathering, but this mission was scheduled for completion in 48 hours maximum. The compressed timeline suggested either that the mission objectives were simpler than described, or that someone expected the operation to end earlier than planned for reasons not included in the official briefing. During equipment inspection, Camela noticed that Specialist Davis was carrying medical supplies far exceeding normal reconnaissance requirements. Davis, who had no advanced medical training, was loaded with trauma equipment, including blood plasma, emergency surgical instruments, and evacuation stretchers. When she asked about the medical supply allocation, Davis's response was telling. Sergeant Rodriguez had to pack for worst-case scenarios. The route planning raised the most serious red flags. Sector 7 was known for its challenging mountain terrain, extreme weather conditions, and limited extraction options. It was exactly the kind of environment where Camela's mountain rescue background would be invaluable, but also exactly the kind of place where soldiers without specialized training could quickly find themselves in life-threatening situations. The fact that 3 inexperienced soldiers were being sent into this terrain suggested either catastrophic planning or deliberate intent. Specialist Chun, normally confident and talkative, was unusually quiet during the pre-mission preparation. When Camela asked about his familiarity with mountain operations, his response revealed the depth of the problem. "This is my first time in terrain above 8,000 feet. Rodriguez said you'd handle any technical climbing if it became necessary." The casual assumption that she would manage the most dangerous aspects of the mission while being excluded from the planning process was both insulting and alarming. The final suspicious element was the communication protocol. Instead of standard hourly check-ins with base command, this mission required contact only every 12 hours unless emergency assistance was needed. The extended communication intervals were completely contrary to protocols for high-risk reconnaissance operations, which typically required frequent updates to ensure team safety. As the team prepared to depart, Camela realized she was facing a situation that felt less like a reconnaissance mission and more like a test designed to push her beyond her limits. The combination of inexperienced personnel, challenging terrain, inadequate preparation time, and minimal support suggested that someone wanted this mission to encounter serious problems. The question that haunted her as they loaded into the transport vehicle was whether the mission was designed to test her capabilities or to prove her limitations. Either way, she was about to find out exactly what happened when the smallest soldier in the unit was finally given the opportunity to demonstrate what she could accomplish under real combat conditions. Within the first hour of the mission, Camela's mountain rescue training began identifying problems that her teammates couldn't see. The terrain in Sector 7 was far more treacherous than the briefing materials had indicated, with unstable rock formations, hidden crevasses, and weather patterns that created dangerous conditions for inexperienced climbers. Her years in the Carpathian Mountains had taught her to read terrain like a survival manual, and everything she saw suggested they were walking into a natural trap. Specialist Morrison, leading the team despite having no mountain warfare training, was making fundamental navigation errors that would have been fatal in civilian rescue operations. He was following the most direct route toward their objective, ignoring the avalanche zones and unstable cliff faces that Camela's trained eye could identify from hundreds of meters away. When she attempted to suggest alternative routes that would provide better tactical positioning and safer passage, Morrison's response revealed the depth of his inexperience. "Novak, we're not on a nature hike. We follow the mission route." The weather conditions were deteriorating faster than anyone except Camela had anticipated. The wind patterns she observed indicated an incoming storm system that would bring freezing temperatures, reduced visibility, and potentially deadly exposure conditions within 18 to 24 hours. In mountain rescue operations, these signs would have triggered an immediate evacuation to lower elevations. But when she attempted to communicate this assessment to the team, Specialist Chun dismissed her concerns. The weather report said clear skies for 48 hours. "You're overthinking everything, just like always." What alarmed Camela most was the equipment mismatches she noticed as they moved through increasingly challenging terrain. None of her teammates had proper cold weather gear for the altitudes they were reaching. Their boots lacked the traction systems necessary for icy conditions. Their clothing wasn't rated for the temperature drops they would experience at higher elevations. And most critically, none of them carried the emergency shelter equipment. That mountain operations required. Her medical assessment of the team revealed additional problems that could quickly become life-threatening. Specialist Davis was already showing early signs of altitude sickness, headache, nausea, and difficulty concentrating despite being at only 9,200 feet elevation. His lack of acclimatization meant that continuing to higher elevations could result in pulmonary edema or cerebral edema, both potentially fatal conditions. When she recommended descent and acclimatization procedures, Davis's response was telling. "I'm fine, Novak. Stop looking for problems." The tactical positioning chosen by Morrison violated every principle of mountain warfare that Camela had studied. They were traveling along ridgelines that would silhouette them against the sky, making them visible to enemy observers from miles away. They were camping in valleys that created natural kill zones, where any hostile force could trap them with minimal effort. Most dangerously, they were following predictable routes that any competent enemy force could easily ambush. Camela's communications training revealed additional strategic problems with their mission parameters. The radio frequencies they had been assigned were experiencing significant interference in the mountain terrain, making contact with base command nearly impossible during daylight hours. This communication breakdown meant they were operating without tactical support or evacuation options if the situation deteriorated. When she attempted to establish alternative communication protocols using her technical knowledge, Specialist Morrison blocked her efforts. "We follow assigned frequencies. Don't complicate things." The most troubling aspect of their situation was the complete absence of contingency planning. In mountain rescue operations, every movement required backup plans for weather changes, equipment failures, and medical emergencies. This military operation had none of those safeguards. When Camela asked about extraction procedures if the weather deteriorated, the team's response revealed how unprepared they were. Rodriguez said the weather would be fine and extraction wouldn't be necessary. Her reconnaissance training, acquired through specialized courses that none of her teammates had attended, identified surveillance indicators that suggested they were being monitored by hostile forces. The positioning of disturbed vegetation, unusual wildlife behavior, and subtle changes in ambient sound patterns all indicated possible enemy observation. These were exactly the kind of details that separated successful reconnaissance operations from disasters. But when she attempted to share these observations, her warnings were dismissed as paranoia. The equipment failures began on schedule, with the predictability of a textbook example of what happens when inexperienced personnel operate in challenging conditions without proper preparation. Specialist Chun's navigation equipment malfunctioned due to condensation problems that could have been prevented with proper weatherproofing techniques. Specialist Davis's cold weather gear proved inadequate when temperatures dropped, leaving him vulnerable to hypothermia. Morrison's communication equipment failed when he attempted to use it, without understanding the power conservation protocols necessary for extended operations. Each of these failures was exactly what Camela's training had taught her to anticipate and prevent. Her Slovak mountain rescue background had exposed her to every possible equipment failure, weather emergency, and human error that could occur in mountain operations. But her teammates' dismissal of her expertise meant they were learning these lessons through dangerous trial and error rather than proper preparation. As they established their first night's camp in a tactically indefensible position during deteriorating weather conditions, Camela realized that her suspicions about the mission had been correct. This wasn't a reconnaissance operation. It was a test designed to push inexperienced soldiers beyond their capabilities while placing her in a position where her specialized skills would become absolutely essential for survival. Dawn of the second day brought the impossible decision that would define not only the mission's outcome, but potentially the rest of Camela's military career. The storm she had predicted arrived exactly as her mountain rescue training had indicated, bringing temperatures that plummeted to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, winds exceeding 40 miles per hour, and visibility reduced to less than 20 meters. What had been a challenging reconnaissance mission had transformed into a survival scenario that her inexperienced teammates were completely unprepared to handle. Specialist Davis was now showing severe symptoms of altitude sickness combined with early-stage hypothermia. His confusion, slurred speech, and inability to maintain body temperature indicated that his condition was rapidly approaching the medical emergency threshold. In civilian mountain rescue operations, Davis would have been evacuated immediately to lower elevations with full medical support. But their current position, 11,400 feet up a mountain face with no established extraction route, made immediate evacuation impossible. The communication breakdown that Camela had anticipated became complete when Specialist Morrison's radio equipment failed entirely during the storm. Their last contact with base command had been 18 hours earlier, and the emergency beacon system was malfunctioning due to the same condensation problems that Camela had warned about during equipment preparation. They were effectively isolated in hostile territory with no support and no way to request assistance. Morrison, faced with conditions that exceeded every aspect of his training, made the decision that Camela had been dreading. "Novak," he said, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who finally understood how unprepared he was for command. "You're taking over navigation and medical decisions. Get us out of this." The irony was staggering. After 18 months of being excluded from meaningful operations, she was suddenly being given command responsibility for a mission that had been designed to test or break her, but accepting command in these circumstances carried enormous personal and professional risks. If the mission succeeded, the official record would likely credit Morrison's leadership and minimize her contributions. If soldiers were seriously injured or killed, she would bear responsibility for decisions made during the most dangerous phase of the operation. Military justice was notoriously unforgiving to soldiers who assumed unauthorized command, especially when operations resulted in casualties. More fundamentally, taking control meant accepting responsibility for the lives of 3 soldiers who had consistently dismissed her expertise and followed orders to exclude her from the preparation that could have prevented this crisis. Davis, Chun, and Morrison had all participated in the systematic undermining of her credibility, yet now their survival depended entirely on skills they had refused to acknowledge she possessed. The tactical situation offered no good options. Continuing toward their original objective would mean moving deeper into territory where the weather conditions would become even more dangerous, and extraction would be impossible if Davis's medical condition deteriorated further. But retreating immediately would mean abandoning the mission without completing any reconnaissance objectives, which would likely result in court-martial proceedings for the entire team. Camela's mountain rescue training provided a third option that her teammates couldn't see: a lateral movement to lower elevations that would allow them to complete modified reconnaissance objectives while moving Davis to safer conditions. But this approach would require advanced climbing techniques, precise route finding through unmarked terrain, and medical management procedures that exceeded standard military training. Success would depend entirely on her specialized skills. While failure would almost certainly result in multiple casualties, the personal stakes were equally challenging. 18 months of systematic exclusion had taught her that even exceptional performance was likely to be credited to others or dismissed as lucky accident. Taking command in this situation meant risking her life and career to save soldiers who had never respected her contributions and who would likely return to the same dismissive attitudes if they survived. But as she looked at Davis, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly, and at Chun and Morrison, whose inexperience in mountain conditions was becoming more obvious with each passing hour, Camela realized that the choice wasn't really about career advancement or personal vindication. The choice was between allowing preventable casualties to occur or using her capabilities to save lives. Regardless of the personal cost or the likelihood of receiving credit, her decision came with absolute clarity. "Morrison, give me your map and GPS coordinates," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had managed emergency rescues in conditions far worse than these. "Chun, start redistributing weight from Davis's pack. We're moving to Rally Point Echo via the northwestern ridge approach. Davis needs medical evacuation to 9,000 feet within 6 hours, and I know how to get him there safely." The moment she spoke those words, Camela Novak stopped being the excluded soldier who was tolerated despite her size and became the technical expert who specialized. Knowledge was the only thing standing between her team and disaster. The test that had been designed to prove her limitations was about to demonstrate capabilities that would redefine what the military thought it knew about effective leadership. What Camela discovered during the first hour of leading the emergency evacuation was that this mission hadn't just been poorly planned, it had been deliberately sabotaged to create exactly the kind of crisis they now faced. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable to someone with her technical background and mountain rescue experience. The GPS coordinates they had been given for Rally Point Echo were off by nearly 800 meters, placing their supposed safe zone in the middle of an avalanche field that would have been instantly lethal in current weather conditions. The error wasn't random, it represented exactly the kind of systematic misdirection that would ensure any team following standard protocols would walk directly into a natural death trap. When Camela cross-referenced the coordinates with topographical maps she had memorized during her own mission preparation, the pattern became undeniable. More damning was the discovery she made while redistributing equipment weight to accommodate Davis's worsening condition. Hidden beneath regulation gear in Morrison's pack were emergency supplies that had never been mentioned in mission briefings: additional medical equipment, high-altitude cold weather gear, and most tellingly, emergency flares specifically designed for mountain rescue operations. Someone had known this mission would require exactly these supplies but had kept that knowledge from the team members who would need to use them. The radio frequency assignments revealed another layer of deliberate deception. While testing alternative communication channels using her technical training, Camela discovered that their assigned frequencies were being actively jammed by equipment operating from a location consistent with their own base operations. The jamming pattern was sophisticated, designed to allow minimal communication while preventing detailed distress calls or tactical updates that might trigger early extraction procedures. As she guided the team through the emergency route, she had calculated using Norwegian avalanche avoidance techniques learned during specialized training. Camela realized that every aspect of their current crisis had been anticipated by whoever planned this mission. The weather window, the terrain challenges, the equipment failures, and even Davis's altitude sickness could have been predicted by anyone with advanced mountain warfare knowledge. The most chilling discovery came when Chun, following her instructions to inventory remaining supplies, found documentation that shouldn't have existed. Buried in his equipment pack was a detailed medical assessment of Davis's susceptibility to altitude sickness, including specific predictions about symptom onset and severity. The document was dated 3 days before the mission began in Bor. The signature of Base Medical Officer Dr. Patterson, who had never been mentioned during mission briefings. "Novak," Chun said, his voice shaking as much from fear as from cold. "This says Davis has a documented medical condition that makes him high risk for mountain operations above 9,000 feet. How did this get in my pack?" The implications were staggering. Davis had been selected for this mission despite known medical vulnerabilities that made altitude sickness almost inevitable. The equipment manifest Chin discovered with the medical documentation revealed the full scope of the setup. Every piece of gear that had failed during the mission was listed with specific failure probabilities under mountain conditions. Morrison's radio equipment was rated as unreliable above 10,000 feet in moisture conditions. The navigation equipment was marked as requires specialized calibration for mountain magnetic interference. The cold weather gear was classified as adequate for temperate conditions only. But most damning was the personnel assessment sheet that fell from Morrison's pack during the equipment redistribution. The document, marked Confidential Training Evaluation, listed each team member's qualifications for mountain operations. Morrison was rated as inexperienced mountain terrain, Chun as no specialized training, cold weather operations, and Davis as medical contraindication, high altitude. At the bottom of the sheet, Camela's assessment read, Specialist Novak, expert level mountain rescue, cold weather operations, emergency medical procedures. Capable of team leadership under extreme conditions. The realization hit her like an avalanche. This wasn't a reconnaissance mission that had gone wrong. It was a deliberately constructed training scenario designed to place her in command when conventional leadership failed. Someone had orchestrated every aspect of this crisis to force her into a situation where her specialized skills would be absolutely essential and publicly documented. The question that terrified her wasn't whether she could get her team out alive. Her training made her confident in that outcome. The question was who had engineered this elaborate test and what they planned to do with the results. Someone with significant authority had invested considerable effort in creating undeniable proof of her capabilities under extreme conditions. As she led the team through a technical climbing sequence that would have been impossible without her mountain rescue background, Camela realized that completing this mission successfully would vindicate everything she had claimed about her qualifications. But it would also prove that the military had been willing to risk soldiers' lives to test theories about non-traditional leadership capabilities. The storm was getting worse. Davis's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and they were still 12 hours from safety. But now she knew that someone, somewhere, was counting on her to succeed. While guiding her team through the treacherous descent that would save Davis's life, Camela began systematically analyzing the evidence she had discovered, applying the same methodical approach that had made her exceptional at technical problem-solving. What emerged was a conspiracy far more sophisticated and dangerous than a simple training exercise designed to test her capabilities. The timing of the mission revealed the first crucial pattern. Cross-referencing the mission date with base personnel schedules that she had memorized during her 18 months of exclusion, Camela realized that every officer who might have questioned the mission parameters was conveniently absent from FOB Thunder. Captain Henderson, The base safety inspector who had previously supported her technical assessments was on leave. Major Williams, who had shown interest in performance metrics that favored her record, was attending a conference in Germany. Colonel Morrison, who had begun asking questions about unit efficiency, was temporarily reassigned to Qatar. The financial implications became clear as she mentally reconstructed the resource allocation for this mission. The specialized equipment hidden in their packs represented over $50,000 in high-altitude gear that had been purchased through emergency procurement channels without standard oversight. Someone with significant budgetary authority had invested substantial resources in creating the perfect testing environment while ensuring that the expenditure wouldn't appear in regular reports. More disturbing was the personnel protection pattern she identified. Every soldier who had previously attempted to support her recommendations or question the sergeant's authority had been systematically transferred, reassigned, or disciplined in the months leading up to this mission. Sergeant Murphy, who had provided honest assessments of her technical skills, had been transferred to a logistics unit in Germany. Private Johnson, who had publicly agreed with her repelling safety assessment, was reassigned to communications duty in Qatar. Specialist Williams, who had defended her performance metrics, was facing disciplinary action for unrelated administrative violations. The medical documentation she had found revealed an even more sinister aspect of the conspiracy. Dr. Patterson's signature on Davis's medical assessment was authentic, but the date had been altered using techniques that would only be detectable through forensic analysis. The original assessment, barely visible under the altered date, was from 8 months earlier, immediately after the repelling incident that had defined her reputation as a troublemaker. Someone had been planning this mission since the moment she had proven her expertise could prevent casualties. Chun's discovery of additional documentation while they navigated a particularly dangerous ice field exposed the true scope of the operation. Hidden in waterproof packaging were copies of her complete military record, including classified psychological evaluations, performance assessments, and most damning, a detailed analysis of her response patterns under stress. The document included predictions about her behavior in command situations, her decision-making priorities, and most chillingly, statistical projections about mission success rates when she was given appropriate authority. The psychological profile was comprehensive and invasive, detailing everything from her childhood experiences with her grandfather's mountain rescue training to her motivational patterns and leadership style. Someone had invested significant intelligence resources in understanding exactly how she would respond to crisis situations. The profile's conclusion was stark. Subject demonstrates exceptional capability for crisis leadership when given appropriate authority. Recommendation: create controlled high-stress environment to document capabilities. For official record, as she led the team through a technical rope descent that saved them 2 hours of dangerous exposure, Camela realized that the conspiracy involved multiple levels of military hierarchy. The psychological assessment bore the signature of Colonel Patterson from Psychological Operations, indicating that this wasn't a local initiative by frustrated sergeants, but a formal military intelligence operation designed to evaluate unconventional leadership potential. The equipment failures that had seemed random now revealed themselves as carefully orchestrated tests of her technical problem-solving abilities. Each failure had been designed to require exactly the kind of specialized knowledge that traditional military training didn't provide. The radio malfunction could only be repaired using communication techniques from her engineering background. The navigation problems required mountain rescue route finding, skills that weren't part of standard military training. The medical emergency demanded trauma care procedures that exceeded basic battlefield medicine. Most troubling was the discovery of real-time monitoring equipment hidden throughout their gear. Someone was tracking their exact location, monitoring their communications, and potentially recording every decision she made during the crisis. The mission wasn't just testing her capabilities, it was creating comprehensive documentation of her performance under extreme conditions. The financial trail Chun uncovered while searching for additional emergency supplies revealed the operation's true scope. Purchase orders for specialized mountain equipment totaled over $200,000, all processed through emergency channels that bypassed normal oversight. Travel authorizations showed that key personnel had been strategically relocated to create the personnel vacuum necessary for the mission to proceed. Medical supply orders included trauma equipment, far exceeding normal reconnaissance requirements, but the most chilling discovery was a sealed, envelope-marked post-mission evaluation protocols that contained detailed procedures for analyzing her performance, including specific metrics for assessing leadership effectiveness, crisis management, and technical innovation. Someone planned to use this mission as definitive proof of concepts that could reshape military leadership evaluation. As they reached the halfway point of their escape route, with Davis's condition stabilizing due to her medical intervention, Camela understood that success would vindicate her capabilities, but also prove that the military was willing to risk lives for experimental leadership assessment programs. The encrypted communication device that Chun discovered hidden in Morrison's pack revealed that this experimental leadership program extended far beyond Fob Thunder and involved soldiers across multiple bases, countries, and military branches. As Camela worked to decrypt the files using techniques from her communications training, the scope of the conspiracy became staggering in its breadth and implications for military culture worldwide. The device contained mission files for 17 similar operations conducted over the past 14 months across bases in Afghanistan, Iraq, Germany, and South Korea. Each operation followed the same pattern: identify a highly qualified soldier whose capabilities were being systematically underutilized due to physical appearance, gender, or cultural background, then create crisis scenarios that would force them into leadership roles while documenting their performance under extreme conditions. The results were extraordinary and disturbing. Operation Mountain Test in Germany had placed a 5'4" female combat engineer in command when her male counterparts failed during a simulated building collapse scenario. She had successfully extracted 12 casualties using techniques that traditional military training hadn't covered. Operation Desert Proof in Iraq had given a soft-spoken intelligence analyst command during a logistics crisis, and he had improvised supply solutions that saved his unit from potentially fatal resource shortages. The human cost was documented with clinical detachment that revealed how expendable the test subjects were considered. 3 operations had resulted in serious injuries when soldiers couldn't meet the extraordinary demands placed on them. One soldier in South Korea had suffered permanent disability during a winter survival test. Another in Iraq was still recovering from injuries sustained during a deliberately sabotaged vehicle maintenance exercise. The files showed that these casualties were classified as acceptable losses in pursuit of revolutionary leadership assessment data. The psychological profiles contained in the encrypted files revealed the true purpose of the program. Traditional military leadership selection was based on physical presence, demonstrated aggression, and conformity to established masculine ideals. But modern warfare increasingly required technical expertise, creative problem-solving, and the ability to manage complex logistical challenges under extreme stress. The experimental program was designed to identify soldiers whose capabilities didn't match traditional leadership profiles, but whose skills were becoming increasingly essential for contemporary military operations. Camela's own profile was the most comprehensive in the database, indicating that she had been under observation since basic training. The assessment included detailed analysis of her family background, educational achievements, psychological resilience, and most disturbing, predictions about how she would respond to systematic exclusion and eventual crisis leadership opportunities. Someone had orchestrated 18 months of professional isolation, specifically to create the psychological conditions that would maximize her performance during this test. The financial scope of the program was breathtaking. Across all 17 operations, the military had invested over $4.2 million in creating elaborate testing scenarios, specialized equipment, psychological evaluation protocols, and sophisticated monitoring systems. The budget allocations came from classified research funds administered by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, indicating that this wasn't a rogue operation, but an officially sanctioned experiment in military leadership development. Most shocking was the discovery that the sergeants who had made her life miserable weren't acting from personal prejudice. They were following detailed psychological manipulation protocols designed to create maximum stress and isolation. Their dismissive comments, exclusionary practices, and systematic undermining of her confidence were carefully scripted behaviors intended to establish baseline psychological conditions for the eventual crisis test. Rodriguez, Martinez, and Thompson had been compensated with special duty pay for their participation in the experimental program. The monitoring technology revealed how comprehensively her performance was being evaluated. Biometric sensors hidden in her gear were tracking heart rate, stress indicators, decision-making speed, and physical performance under extreme conditions. Audio recording devices were capturing her leadership communication patterns, crisis management techniques, and team coordination methods. Video surveillance was documenting her technical problem-solving approaches and innovative applications of her specialized training. The post-mission analysis protocols outlined exactly how her performance would be used to revolutionize military leadership selection. If the experimental program proved that non-traditional candidates could outperform conventional leaders under crisis conditions, it would justify fundamental changes to recruitment standards, promotion criteria, and training programs. The data from her mission would become the foundation for new military policies that could affect thousands of future soldiers. But the most disturbing revelation was the program's expansion plans. Phase 2 involved creating permanent crisis leadership positions for soldiers who demonstrated exceptional performance during the experimental scenarios. Phase 3 called for establishing new military units composed entirely of non-traditional leaders who had proven their capabilities through similar testing programs. The ultimate goal was transforming military culture from traditional, hierarchy-based systems to performance-based leadership structures. As they navigated the final technical climbing section that would bring them to safety, Camela realized that success would not only save her team's lives, but would also provide definitive proof that military leadership effectiveness wasn't determined by physical size or traditional masculine characteristics. The weight of that responsibility was almost as challenging as carrying 3 wounded soldiers through hostile territory. The question now wasn't whether she could complete the mission. Her training made success almost inevitable. The question was whether she was prepared to become the catalyst for fundamental changes in military culture that would affect generations of future soldiers. The revelation that would transform Camela's understanding of the entire operation came from the most unlikely source, Specialist Davis, whose deteriorating condition had masked the fact that he was far more aware of the mission's true nature than anyone realized. As she administered advanced medical treatment that stabilized his altitude sickness symptoms, Davis made a confession that changed everything she thought she knew about the conspiracy. "Novak," Davis whispered, his voice weak but lucid for the first time in hours, "I need to tell you something before we reach base. I'm not just a soldier on this mission. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's nephew, and I volunteered to be here." The revelation hit her like an avalanche. Davis wasn't an inexperienced soldier who had been unknowingly placed in danger. He was a willing participant in the experimental program who had accepted personal risk to help document her capabilities. The medical documentation they had found earlier suddenly made sense in a completely different context. Davis's altitude. Sickness wasn't an overlooked medical vulnerability. It was a calculated element of the test designed to create a genuine medical emergency that would require her advanced trauma training. He had been medically cleared for the mission with full knowledge that his condition would deteriorate, creating authentic crisis conditions that couldn't be dismissed as simulation or training exercise. My uncle has been fighting for 2 years to get approval for this leadership assessment program, Davis continued. His breathing labored, but his words carefully chosen. The traditional military hierarchy has been blocking every attempt to evaluate non-conventional leadership potential. They needed undeniable proof that soldiers like you could outperform traditional leaders under actual crisis conditions, not just training scenarios. The personal risk Davis had accepted was staggering. Altitude sickness at the elevations they had reached could have caused permanent brain damage or death if not treated properly. He had literally bet his life on Camela's medical expertise and leadership capabilities, trusting that her mountain rescue background would provide the knowledge necessary to save him when conventional military medical training would have been insufficient. But Davis's revelation exposed an even more complex layer to the operation. The sergeants back at base, Rodriguez, Martinez, Thompson, they don't know about the experimental program, he explained. Their prejudice and exclusionary behavior is genuine, which made them perfect, unwitting participants. Uncle Patterson needed authentic hostile environment to document how you would perform when facing real discrimination and systematic exclusion. This meant that while higher-level military officials were conducting sophisticated psychological experiments, day-to-day persecution Camela had endured was entirely real. The sergeant's mockery, dismissive comments, and career-limiting assignments weren't scripted behaviors. They were genuine expressions of prejudice that had been deliberately leveraged to create the testing environment the experimental program required. Davis handed her a sealed waterproof pouch that he had kept hidden throughout the mission. These are the real mission parameters, he said. Uncle Patterson wanted you to have them if the situation became life-threatening. The documents inside revealed the true scope of what was at stake and why such extraordinary measures had been necessary to obtain definitive proof of her capabilities. The sealed orders showed that congressional oversight committees were demanding evidence-based justification for proposed changes to military leadership selection criteria. Traditional military leaders were arguing that physical presence and conventional masculine characteristics were essential for combat effectiveness. Progressive military researchers were claiming that technical expertise and non-traditional leadership styles were becoming more important for modern warfare success. Camela's mission wasn't just testing her individual capabilities, it was providing crucial evidence for a congressional hearing that would determine military personnel policies for the next decade. The $4.2 million investment in the experimental program was designed to produce data that could influence legislation, affecting millions of military personnel and hundreds of billions in defense spending. The political implications explained why such elaborate and risky testing procedures had been necessary. Anecdotal evidence and training exercise results could be dismissed by traditional military leaders as irrelevant to actual combat conditions. But documented performance during genuine life-threatening emergencies would provide irrefutable evidence that non-traditional leaders could not only match, but exceed the effectiveness of conventional military leadership under extreme conditions. The monitoring equipment isn't just collecting performance data, Davis explained, pointing to the hidden sensors in their gear. It's creating legal documentation that will be submitted as evidence in federal hearings. Every decision you've made, every technical innovation, every life-saving intervention is being recorded as proof that military leadership effectiveness isn't determined by physical size or traditional characteristics. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Camela wasn't just responsible for getting her team safely off the mountain. She was unknowingly providing testimony that would influence military culture for generations. Her success would vindicate every non-traditional soldier who had been excluded from leadership opportunities, while failure would reinforce prejudices that kept qualified people from serving effectively. But Davis's final revelation was the most personally significant. Uncle Patterson specifically requested that you be informed about the program's true nature if your life was in danger. He said, he wanted you to understand that regardless of the political implications, your survival and the survival of your team was always the primary objective. The data collection was important, but not worth risking actual lives. As they prepared for the final descent that would bring them to safety, Camela understood that she had gained not just an ally but a witness whose testimony would transform her individual act of courage into evidence for systemic change in military culture. With the truth about the experimental program revealed and her team's survival assured, Camela made a decision that would transform her from test subject to active participant in reshaping military leadership standards. Instead of simply completing the mission as designed, she chose to exceed every parameter of the assessment, while creating undeniable documentation of capabilities that would revolutionize how the military evaluated leadership potential. The final phase of their descent required carrying Davis and supporting Chun, whose exhaustion had reached dangerous levels, across 2 miles of hostile terrain while potentially under enemy surveillance. Rather than taking the safest route that would minimize risk, Camela deliberately chose a path that would demonstrate the full range of her technical expertise while ensuring maximum documentation of her leadership capabilities. Using her communications training, she re-established contact with Base Command by improvising a signal amplification system from salvaged equipment parts. The solution required engineering knowledge that wasn't part of standard military training, and she ensured that every technical innovation was clearly explained over the radio for the monitoring systems to record. Base Command, this is Team Alpha. I'm implementing emergency communication protocol using modified antenna configuration with salvaged components to overcome mountain terrain interference. Her medical management of Davis's condition went beyond standard battlefield treatment to demonstrate advanced trauma care capabilities that exceeded most military medics' training. She performed procedures that required understanding of high-altitude physiology, hypothermia treatment, and emergency field medicine while maintaining detailed verbal documentation of each intervention. Patient shows signs of high altitude cerebral edema. Implementing immediate descent protocol with supplemental oxygen conservation and controlled rewarming procedures. The tactical decisions she made during the final approach showcased strategic thinking that challenged conventional military doctrine. Instead of avoiding potential enemy contact, she chose routes that would allow her team to complete reconnaissance objectives while evacuating casualties, proving that mission success and personnel safety weren't mutually exclusive when proper leadership techniques were applied. Most significantly, Camela began deliberately articulating her decision-making process for the monitoring equipment, transforming the test from passive observation into active demonstration of leadership philosophy. Leadership in crisis situations requires balancing immediate safety needs with long-term mission objectives, she stated clearly while organizing her team for the final push. Technical expertise becomes force multiplication when combined with comprehensive situational awareness. Her approach to team management during the crisis directly contradicted traditional military leadership models that emphasized hierarchy and unquestioning obedience. Instead, she created collaborative decision-making processes that leveraged each team member's strengths while compensating for their limitations. She assigned Chun navigation responsibilities that matched his skills while taking medical management duties that exceeded his training. She gave Morrison tactical oversight roles that maintained his leadership dignity while ensuring Decisions were made by the most qualified person, the innovation that would become legendary in military leadership. Training was her solution to the fundamental problem of carrying 3 soldiers to safety. Rather than attempting to carry each person individually, which would have been physically impossible and tactically dangerous, she improvised an assisted mobility system using climbing equipment and pack frames that allowed the wounded to move under their own power while maintaining necessary medical support. The system required advanced understanding of biomechanics, equipment engineering, and tactical medicine, but more importantly, it demonstrated leadership thinking that found solutions through innovation rather than brute force. Effective leadership multiplies capabilities through system design rather than individual heroics. She explained for the recording equipment as she guided her team through the implementation of her mobility solution. Her real gambit was the comprehensive after-action report she began composing mentally during the final descent. Rather than allowing others to interpret her performance, she was preparing detailed documentation of every leadership decision, technical innovation, and crisis management technique that could be used as training material for future non-traditional military leaders. By the time they reached the extraction point, Camela had transformed a test designed to evaluate her capabilities into a masterclass in innovative military leadership that would become required study material for advanced command training. She had demonstrated that effective leadership wasn't about conforming to traditional masculine military stereotypes, but about applying appropriate expertise to achieve mission objectives while prioritizing personnel welfare. The sight of the extraction team waiting for them at the designated coordinates confirmed that the entire operation had been monitored in real time. Medical personnel immediately took charge of Davis's care. Communications specialists began downloading data from the monitoring equipment, and most tellingly, Colonel Patterson himself was present to observe the team's return. As she helped transfer Davis to the medical evacuation helicopter, Camela realized that her strategic gambit had succeeded. She hadn't just passed the test, she had redefined what the test was measuring and established new standards for how leadership effectiveness should be evaluated in modern military operations. The expression on Colonel Patterson's face as he reviewed the preliminary performance data confirmed that the FOBD experimental program had achieved far more than its original objectives. The congressional hearing that took place 6 weeks after Camela's mountain rescue mission would be remembered as the moment American military culture fundamentally shifted from tradition-based to performance-based leadership evaluation. Her mission data, combined with evidence from 16 other experimental operations, provided irrefutable proof that non-traditional soldiers could not only match but consistently exceed the performance of conventional leaders under extreme conditions. Immediate consequences for FOB Thunder were swift and comprehensive. Sergeants Rodriguez, Martinez, and Thompson faced formal review for systematic discrimination that had cost the military effective utilization of specialized personnel, while their prejudiced behavior had inadvertently served the experimental program's purposes. Official investigations revealed a pattern of excluding qualified soldiers that had affected unit effectiveness and endangered lives through improper personnel assignments. More significantly, the financial audit triggered by Camela's mission revealed that traditional leadership selection methods had been costing the military over $180 million annually in wasted specialized training, inefficient resource allocation, and preventable operational failures. The data showed that soldiers with technical expertise and non-traditional backgrounds consistently achieved superior results in complex modern warfare scenarios that required innovation rather than intimidation. The policy changes implemented based on the experimental program's findings revolutionized military personnel management across all service branches. Physical fitness requirements were restructured to emphasize functional capability rather than traditional strength metrics. Leadership selection criteria were expanded to include technical expertise, crisis innovation capability, and collaborative management skills. Most importantly, promotion protocols were modified to prevent the systematic exclusion of qualified personnel based on physical appearance or cultural background. Captain Henderson, the safety inspector who had previously supported Camela's technical assessments, was promoted to colonel and assigned to oversee implementation of the new leadership evaluation standards. His first initiative was establishing mandatory diversity and inclusion training that specifically addressed unconscious bias. In military leadership assessment, the training program used footage from Camela's mission as a case study in recognizing and developing non-traditional leadership potential. The ripple effects of the experimental program extended far beyond personnel policy. Military training. Academies incorporated Camela's innovative problem-solving techniques into required curricula for advanced command courses. Her collaborative leadership model became standard training for officers assigned to technical operations, special forces units, and international cooperation missions where traditional authoritarian approaches had proven less effective. But the most satisfying vindication for Camela came in the form of letters from soldiers across the military who had been inspired by her story to pursue leadership opportunities they had previously thought impossible. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a 5'1" communications specialist, wrote that Camela's example had given her the confidence to apply for special operations training. Captain Maria Santos, a combat engineer, credited Camela's mission documentation with helping her secure promotion to battalion command despite initial resistance from traditional military leaders. The financial impact of implementing performance-based leadership selection was dramatic and measurable. Within 18 months, units that adopted the new criteria showed 40% improvement in mission completion rates, 60% reduction in equipment-related casualties, and 35% increase in operational efficiency. The cost savings from reduced equipment failures, improved tactical planning, and more effective resource utilization exceeded $400 million in the first year alone. Camela's personal trajectory following the mission reflected the systemic changes her performance had catalyzed. She was promoted to warrant officer and assigned to develop advanced leadership training programs for non-traditional military personnel. Her responsibilities included designing crisis management curricula, establishing technical leadership assessment protocols, and mentoring soldiers whose capabilities had been previously underutilized by traditional military culture. The mountain rescue techniques she had used to save her team became required training for all special operations personnel operating in challenging terrain. Her medical innovations were incorporated into advanced battlefield medicine protocols. Her communication solutions were adopted as standard procedures for units operating in environments where conventional equipment might fail. But Camela's greatest achievement wasn't the institutional changes her mission had prompted. It was the cultural transformation that allowed thousands of qualified soldiers to serve effectively without having to prove themselves through life-threatening ordeals. The experimental program was discontinued not because it failed, but because it had succeeded so completely that elaborate testing scenarios were no longer necessary to document non-traditional leadership capabilities. 5 years after her mountain mission, Colonel Camela Novak addressed the graduating class at West Point with words that had become the unofficial motto of modern military leadership. Excellence isn't measured by how much you weigh or how tall you stand. It's measured by how effectively you can solve problems, save lives, and accomplish missions that others thought impossible. The military doesn't need soldiers who look like leaders. It needs soldiers who can actually lead. Her story had proven that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against external enemies, but against internal assumptions that prevent organizations from recognizing and developing their most valuable human resources. Camela Novak had carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety, but more importantly, She had carried the entire military toward a future where capability mattered more than appearance, and where the smallest person in the room might just be the one everyone needed watching their back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.